Hey everyone, today we're going to be covering the fundamentals and basics of V-Ray materials in Maya using V-Ray Next. We'll be covering several parameters on the most used shader in V-Ray and Maya, known simply as V-Ray material. The outcome of this tutorial will help you understand how to manipulate these settings to create basic material types like plastic, rubber, metal, and glass, like you see in the sample renders in front of you. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here we are in Maya. So a quick intro to this scene. I just have a simple backdrop and I have this cool looking shader ball. If you're interested in grabbing this shader ball, look up Mastering CGI with Grant Warwick and you should be able to download that online. Alright, so we have this scene set up and we have a couple of simple lights, V-Ray rectangle lights that I've just created using this here. So just to make sure you're able to follow along, I'm going to be using the V-Ray tab here, and you can see that I can create lights however big that I need to. If you're interested in the basics of lighting, go ahead and take a look at one of my previous tutorials on lighting in V-Ray. All right, so I have these two lights set up, and if I go ahead and do a simple render, actually before that, let's look at our render settings. I'm using full 1024 for resolution. For our image sampler, I'm using progressive. And for GI, I'm using irradiance map with low settings, which you can change here, irradiance map. And then our secondary is light cache. And if you jump down, I just set light cache to 500 to iterate faster. And I can go ahead now and do a quick render. So if I go ahead and render, you see that we're starting to get light in our scene, which is great. But at the same time, it's still pretty flat. And ideally, you're going to want something with a bit more light to be able to see, the material details and how it interacts within the environment. So a good way to do this in combination with using these V-Ray lights is that you can use environment override. So if I go to overrides here in the render settings and enable environment override or override environment, you can see that now it gives me a list of options. So just by enabling that, you can see that GI texture is set to this kind of this light blue, and it's going to go ahead and essentially create this background environment or this GI environment as that light white, which is good, but it's still not giving us a lot for reflections. So what I typically like to do is under reflection texture, go ahead and uh, select the color map option and scroll down to file and enable file. Now, we're going to put in an HDR image. So what I'm going to do is grab this HDR that I've already downloaded. And if you're interested in downloading this, this is simply from HDRI Haven. You can go to HDRI's, Studio, and then you can grab one of these guys here. I believe I use Studio Small 2. And yep, I go ahead and open. And then now what that's going to do is give me the reflections from that HDR, but still use that GI texture. So now when I go ahead and render, let's see what happens. All right, great. So with this basic material, you can see that now we're starting to get some more response to the light. So if I go ahead and stop that, you can kind of see the difference. It's going to be really helpful when we start adding different material types. All right, great. So that's the lighting and render settings. So let's just go ahead and jump right into materials now. So what I'm going to do, if you're following along with a different model, just simply select your model and hold right click, and then you can just do assign new material. Now here's the material that we want to create. We want to create a V-Ray material. So go ahead and select that, and then now it's gone ahead and assigned this new V-Ray material. So I can call this, main material. All right. Now, of course, while we're editing this, I typically like to use the hypershade here. So it's this little spherical icon in our at the top here. So go ahead and click and open on my second monitor, and I can go ahead and drag that over here. So now we can see that we're looking for main material here, and this is the new one that we've created. And to see this down here, select the material and then output connections. Great. So now we have the main material here, and so we can start modifying the properties that we have here. So as we're going through, right, we can start changing these parameters. So the first thing I want to take a look at right now is the diffuse color. As the name implies, this is just going to change our base color. And one thing that Maya has, which is really nice, is you can change this from hardware in the hypershade to V-Ray. So if I go ahead and change that, you can see now, you might hear your fans kick on and whatnot. This is going to be using GPU rendering to render this in the viewport, which makes it really nice to iterate. So I can go ahead and change this to any color that I want. See this yellow here, and this is going to change this base color. All right. So of course you can do any mixture. If I want to drop the saturation, the hue, or the value, and then change the hue here. Okay. So this is our base diffuse color. Then we have right here amount. Now, just in case, if you're following along and you see something else different here, keep in mind you have to toggle between this view here, right? So this is look dev view, which might have defaulted there. And if you hit this, this is going to switch to attribute editor view, which you see here. So I can just hit Control A to bounce in the attribute editor. So if you're looking this in dev view, you can switch those kind of back and forth. But if you want what I'm seeing here, you want to make sure you're in attribute editor view. Now, then you have the amount. Now that's the amount of diffuse color. As you change this, you can see that it's essentially kind of multiplying that color. And I typically leave this at 1. If I ever really want to change the saturation of the color, I just do that in the saturation here. And just, use whatever I need to in the HSV or RGB. Then you have opacity mode. Now, opacity mode is not refraction. So you typically use this for cutouts, right? So you can see that it's starting to fade, but we're getting no refraction. So just to show a quick example of this, if I go here now to the main material, and let's say I'm over here and I go to 2D textures, and we have checker here. So if I click checker, you can see that the checker has been added. So I just simply left click, and then we can go back to main material and middle mouse drag this over opacity map. Now what this is going to do, it's going to kind of start cutting things out. Anything that's white will appear. Anything that's black will be cut out. So if I go over here to this place 2D texture, I can change the tiling and whatnot to 10 by 10 so you can kind of see what's happening, and you can start to see through the checker here. Now, we're not going to be messing too much with opacity, but I just wanted to make sure to cover that property. So I can go ahead and just delete those nodes now and make sure to set opacity back to pure white. All right. So we're just going to jump down here. Roughness mode is default 0. Now, if you're working with kind of like more dusty or chalk-like materials, you're going to want to crank this up to a roughness of 1. Now, keep in mind, this is not the same roughness as down here, which we're going to get to. So go ahead and just leave this at the default 0, so you can kind of see the difference here as you're changing these settings. And then we have self-illumination under basic parameters, which self-illumination is going to make the objects appear to glow from within. So if I set this maybe to, this kind of green material, it's essentially going to be self-illuminated. All right. Now by default, it's not going to cast any light, but this is good for like if you have like a lampshades or anything that like a light bulb or something like that. That's going to make it look like it's lit from within. So for now, we'll just go ahead and set that back to black and then continue to scroll down. Now, here is where things get a lot more interesting. All right, so now we have our reflection properties. Okay, now the first thing is, I'm not going to get too in depth about this, but your BRDF type, which BRDF is bidirectional reflectance distribution function. And all that means is, how does the material handle reflections? Okay, by default, always make sure to use GGX. Okay, so these are different logarithms and functions. You want to stick with GGX, which is the latest and greatest, newest way of calculating light. So if I actually increase reflection color here to white, now we start to get something that looks a little bit interesting. So we kind of have this green material here, and you can start to see the reflections coming through. Now, if I change this to something like a Phong, it might be subtle, but I'll go ahead and actually drop this glossiness so you can kind of see a little bit of the difference between these. So you can start to see the difference between how it handles specular reflections. So for now, there's Phong, there's Blinn, which is a little bit more blurry, and then you have Ward, which is typically used for metallic, but like I said, always stick with GGX. It just gives you better detail and is more physically accurate. Okay, so I'm going to crank this back up. And we have this reflection color. So at any time, if I wanted to change this base material, so like I said, if I wanted a blue plastic, I can go to this kind of this blue here, drop the saturation a little bit in value, and maybe we're gonna get something, we'll get something kind of like this. Great. So we have this blue here, and then now we have the reflection color. Notice what happens when I start scrubbing this down. The reflection, the highlights, are going to start becoming this less of a pure white. So more gray until I get all the way down here and then ultimately to black. Okay, so it's very flat at this point. But the second you kick this on, it's going to start giving you reflection highlights. All right, so if I go ahead and set this to pure white, and then I always leave amount at 1. And then for glossiness, that's where it's going to, you dictate how shiny or matte, right? So we have glossiness, which is super shiny, or rough, which is the opposite of glossiness. So if I drop this all the way down, you can see that it basically turned back to having no reflections whatsoever. I typically never have to go lower than zero point 0.4, zero point 0.5. Um, as you can see here, this we still get a lot of good highlights here at like 0.6, zero point 0.4. And then just know that the lower this does, the more sampling that V-Ray has to do to get softer and cleaner reflections. Okay, so I'll go ahead and actually set this so you can see if I set it back to 1, pure shiny plastic, which is great. And if I set this to maybe 0.6, 0.7, we start to get more of a matte plastic. And then even lower, maybe 0.4, 0.5, we start to get something like a matte rubber. All right, so far so good. Now, well, what if I want to start working with metallic objects? Well, what you used to have to do, and you can just watch as I do this, is disable lock Fresnel IOR and set the Fresnel IOR to something like 10. Okay, well, it gives you good results, but it isn't 100% physically accurate. Well, what V-Ray has done now is included a metalness property, which is now in V-Ray Next. So what that means is, well, let me go ahead and set this diffuse color of this object to white. So here we have this pure white object. And if I go down to metalness, let me take this from 0 and just move that all the way to 1 and take a look at that. Now it's a little bit hard to see. It's kind of this really matte or rough metal. Let's go ahead and set this back to reflection glossiness to 1. Now you can see that this is a pure metal chrome-like material, which is great. So we don't have to crank up Fresnel IOR too high to get that value, and the metalness is giving us the exact result that we want. Now keep in mind, you want to kind of treat this like a Boolean almost. So whenever you want a metal object, set this to 1. No, not metal or plastic, set to 0. So you can see that it's plastic. And what that's typically called is dielectric and non-dielectric or conductors. And what I mean by that, if I go ahead and go to V-Ray's blog here. They have a really good post on understanding metalness. So you can see dielectrics are, like marble, porcelain, glass, wood, paper, and conductives or non-dielectrics are typically going to be your metal objects. So you're going to have kind of like this gold, brass, you know, yeah, anything that's metal, copper, all that good stuff. So that's a good way to kind of think about it. So if I go ahead and set this back to 1, you can see now I have kind of the shiny. And then if I wanted to lower the glossiness to get something that looks, a little bit more, not perfect like chrome, you can do that here. And if you want to be even more physically accurate, you can start to see how you can go get the base diffuse color from this blog post as well as reflection color. So if you wanted something like gold, right, you can actually type in the base color, of 243, 201, 104 here. So I'll just move that over to the left and I can go to base color here and I can type in, change this actually to RGB 255 and just type in these values of 243, 201, and 104. And that's going to kind of give us this gold look here. And we can even plug in this IOR value for gold, which is 1.35, which is the index of refraction, okay? So what you want to do is disable lock Fresnel IOR, and this essentially is the intensity that things are refractive at extreme angles, okay? So we have 1.35 there, and then the reflection color is going to be still set to pure white. So if I go ahead actually now and do a quick render of this, and it's just verifying what viewport, so I'm going to mouse here, do a quick render. Now we're getting this kind of cool looking gold. And if I wanted to, I can crank up the reflection glossiness to, something like a high 0.9, and it starts to look a lot more like gold. Okay, so that's great. And if I wanted a plastic, I can just set this metalness back down to 0. I can go to this diffuse color, and I had one of my blues here, so I'll just set it back there. It really doesn't matter, just you can change the color. And go ahead and render that. And then now you can see that we start to get this blue plastic again. Great. So things are starting to look good. And we can notice a difference between kind of this gold metal and this blue plastic, all with changing these core properties here. And then if we want to get and create something like glass, well, let me go ahead and just set this material. I will set this back to, let's just set it to white. So a nice little trick is if you drag this all the way left and then all the way right, it'll set it back to black and white. Okay, and reflection glossiness, I will set the Fresnel IOR back to 1.6 and then enable lock Fresnel IOR to refraction IOR. All right, so now here we are down at refraction. Okay, now to get a glass material, we're going to increase the color of refraction color to white. So let's go ahead and start doing that. So notice what starts to happen. It starts to become more refractive. And if I do it all the way up until it gets pure white, you can see, great, we've now got glass. So if I go ahead and actually, I'm just going to set IPR here. You notice when you do that here, it stops doing that in the hypershade, which is great. Okay, I'm going to actually just move my hypershade here and use the attribute editor to do some work. Okay, so now that we have this refraction color, all right, now you can actually drop the, sorry, not the amount, the glossiness here to kind of give it more of this kind of foggy look for this, or this foggy or frosted look, I should say. Okay, notice that the reflections are still coming in really crisp, which is this here, and then what's being impacted is the refraction. So keep in mind these are two separate values. Now, if you wanted the reflection to also be foggy and frosted, well, you go ahead and just drop that in the reflection as well. All right, so I'm going to kind of keep this at reflection 1. I'll go ahead and keep refraction at 1, so it kind of renders a little bit faster. And well, what if we want to change this to kind of like a green or purple or blue vase? Well, Notice if you go to refraction color and try to change that, nothing's going to actually change. Or it's not going to give you the result that you want, right? Because what's happening is light's kind of coming in and it's actually bouncing the opposite color here, all right? So instead, what you do is you change the fog color. So I go ahead, let's say if I want this to be, again, a purple or a blue, well, let me go ahead and scroll this up now. You can see that we can go ahead and start changing this color now, and it starts to update in our IPR, which is great. So we kind of got this blue. Now, we've kind of got this light blue, and it's looking really dark blue. Well, that's where the fog multiplier is going to come in. So I can go ahead now and start dragging this down quite a bit lower, and this is really sensitive. Maybe I'll just need to type in a value. So I go ahead and type in a value of 0.01. So you can see now we start to get this really cool looking blue effect. And if I even go a little bit lighter, 0.05, it starts to work out really well. So keep in mind, your refraction IOR or your index of refraction is going to give you different results depending on the material type. Now, for refraction IOR, if I set this to 1, that essentially becomes air, okay? So as you increase this, water is like 1.3, glass is 1.6, you're going to get different effects, and it's going to impact how it refracts light. Okay. Now there are of course things like subsurface scattering, which I won't get into today since we're just going on basics, and as well as the dispersion. Okay. Now dispersion, actually, if I just go ahead and enable this, take a look at what happens. This is really, really great for um, caustics, but just keep in mind it's actually calculating the light rays. What it's doing is the light's coming in, it's being dispersed, so it's breaking it up like a prism, bouncing it, and then it comes back out until it cleans up. And that just will give you more realistic results and better caustics, but render times are going to be significantly longer. All right, great. So let me go ahead and actually I can just set this back to white, and I'm going to set my refraction color back to black, which will kind of reset this material. Okay, so we've went ahead and covered um, all of these core properties. The next thing I want to look into is the anisotropy. So if I go here and set this back to a metallic value of 1, and I drop the reflection glossiness to about 0.875, something like that, the anisotropy is going to allow us to kind of get that more machined or brushed look. And if I increase this value to something like zero point 0.8, so I'll go ahead and just type in anisotropy at 0.8, and then I can set the anisotropy rotation to something like 90, and this is degrees. So you can start to see what happens here, and this will just give you control and change the rotations on the metallic properties. You can of course change it depending on the axis. So you have X axis, the Y axis, and the Z axis. All right, so that's going to give you some good results uh, when you're changing metallic anisotropy values. So I'll go ahead and set this kind of back to 0 here, and I'll go ahead and set that back to 0. Okay, so I just want to cover the basic material properties today, and then in the next video, I'm actually going to cover in detail on how to start plugging in textures to get more advanced and more detailed materials. All right, so if you have any questions on the process, be sure to leave a comment down below and like and subscribe. Always appreciated. Okay, thanks everyone. Take care.